Sometimes, history hides its darkest secrets in plain sight. And sometimes, those secrets don't stay hidden forever. In the summer of 1897, a fire ripped through the Crane Mansion in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Servants rushed to save silverware, portraits, and heirlooms from the flames. But one servant, by pure accident, found something far more valuable than gold. Behind a bookshelf, in a hidden compartment blackened by smoke, lay a leather-bound ledger. At first, it looked like any other household record. But when the servant opened it, his hands began to shake. 3 columns filled every page in neat, perfect handwriting. The first column listed hundreds of names, men, women, and children from the surrounding counties. Over 400 in total. The second column recorded their dates of acquisition. And the third column, chillingly simple, listed their dates of death, followed by just one word. Processed. The servant later claimed the ledger smelled metallic and foul, like the steel foundries down by the river. When authorities took possession of the book, they promised an investigation. But within days, the case was closed. The ledger disappeared, and for years, the truth about Bartholomew Crane, steel magnate, family patriarch, and monster, was buried under money, influence, and fear. This is where our story begins. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what state you're watching from. We love hearing from mystery seekers all across America. Because what happened next would shatter the polished image of America's Gilded Age and expose horrors that history tried to erase. Fort Wayne in the 1880s. To understand Bartholomew Crane, you first have to picture Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the 1880s. The city was booming. Steam engines roared through rail yards, factories belched smoke into the sky, and steel, the very bones of America's future, was being forged day and night. At the center of it all stood Crane Steelworks, a sprawling industrial giant that employed nearly 3,000 men. The steel was so fine, people said it rivaled Pittsburgh's. And the man behind it all, Bartholomew Crane, became a local legend. He wasn't just rich, he was larger than life. Crane stood 6'3", with sharp blue eyes and striking silver hair that made him look like an aristocrat. Born dirt poor on an Ohio farm, he had clawed his way up to fortune with sheer determination. By the age of 38, he owned the steelworks, vast farmland, several factories, and even a private railroad line connecting Fort Wayne to Chicago. His fortune was estimated at $2 million, the kind of money that made him one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest. But wealth wasn't what made Bartholomew Crane infamous. It was his family. The extended family. In an era when polite society whispered about affairs and secret marriages, Crane was shockingly open about his unusual domestic arrangements. He called it his extended family. At the heart of it stood Crane Manor, a Gothic revival mansion with 40 rooms and towers that scraped the Indiana sky. Here lived what locals called the primary family, 7 wives and 23 children. Each wife had her own wing of the house, complete with nurseries and private sitting rooms. Crane even drew up spiritual matrimony contracts for each wife. These documents promised financial security and protection in exchange for their loyalty to the family unit. But Crane's empire of love didn't end there. He kept multiple estates scattered across Allen County. Willowbrook Farm, 20 miles south, housed 5 wives and 16 children. Riverside House, near the St. Mary's River, was home to 4 wives and 12 children. Each estate had servants, tutors, and governesses. Each ran like its own little kingdom. What made this arrangement truly shocking wasn't just the scale, it was the openness. Crane would attend church with one wife, then show up to a social gala with another. He threw lavish parties where his many families mingled freely. At first, Fort Wayne society was scandalized. But over time, they adjusted. Reporters praised his wives for their elegance and charitable work. Newspapers printed glowing articles about his children's academic achievements. Religious leaders, who once condemned him, softened their stance, calling his arrangement a kind of Christian charity, offering homes to women who might otherwise remain unmarried. Local businessmen joked about Crane's diplomatic skills in keeping so many wives happy. Some even asked him for advice on managing their own marriages. Crane always gave the same answer. Treat each woman as if she were the only woman in the world. To the public, the Crane family looked like a picture of harmony. But beneath the polished veneer, shadows were growing. Whispers behind closed doors. If you asked Crane's wives about life inside the manor, they would smile politely, but there were things they wouldn't talk about. Some mentioned off-limits areas of the estate, whole wings of the basement that were locked away. Servants whispered about strange deliveries that arrived at night. Children hinted at secrets in the dark. One of Crane's sons, little Edmund, once told a friend that his father had a special place, where bad people go to learn how to be good. Another child, Margaret, said she sometimes heard sad singing beneath the library floor. Servants reported finding bloodstains on clothing sent down from the manor's hidden rooms. Groundskeepers saw crates of odd tools and machinery delivered to basement entrances. Kitchen staff noticed meals prepared for dozens of people, but no extra guests ever appeared. Even the wives themselves showed subtle signs of fear. They rarely traveled alone. They never spoke about their families of origin. Crane explained that away by saying they were all orphans, or estranged from relatives who disapproved. And yet, something about their silence suggested otherwise. The legend solidifies. By 1890, Bartholomew Crane had cemented his reputation. He wasn't just Indiana's steel king, he was a man who had supposedly mastered both industry and family life. Visitors came from across the country to tour his steelworks and marvel at his strange but seemingly harmonious household. But in the shadows of his empire, secrets festered. Secrets that would one day rise from the flames of Crane Mansion, in the form of a ledger. A ledger that revealed the truth. And in our next episode, we'll dig deeper into what the word, processed, really meant. Right finger don't forget. If you're fascinated by this forgotten chapter of American history, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your state, and join our growing community of truth seekers. Part 2 is where the real horror begins. Would you like me to make Part 2 continue directly with the meaning of processed and the first disappearances, or should it shift focus to Crane's rise and how people started going missing around Fort Wayne before tying back to the ledger? The Ledger of Bartholomew Crane, Part 2. Studio microphone opening narration for YouTube audience, paired with dark rain-soaked visuals. Hook. The higher a man climbs, the further he has to fall. By the late 1880s, Bartholomew Crane wasn't just the steel king of Indiana, he was a rising star of the entire Midwest. His businesses were thriving, his family empire fascinated the press, and some newspapers even floated his name as a future governor of Indiana. But while politicians and society pages praised his genius, whispers were spreading in the shadows. Whispers that began in the immigrant neighborhoods of Fort Wayne, and echoed in the hobo camps along the railroad tracks. Stories of men and women who walked into the Crane steelworks looking for work, and were never seen again. Families who answered job ads at Crane's estates, and vanished without a trace. And while most dismissed these tales as drunken gossip or immigrant superstition, the fall of 1890 brought the first undeniable crack in Bartholomew Crane's carefully polished empire. The labor shortage. That year, Fort Wayne faced a crisis. The industrial boom sweeping across the Midwest created more jobs than there were workers to fill them. Factory owners were desperate, raising wages and offering bonuses just to keep men on the floor. But there was one glaring exception. Crane Steelworks. While every other industrialist struggled to fill positions, Crane's factories never missed a beat. New workers seemed to appear overnight, ready to take up the hammer and shovel. They worked long shifts with quiet precision. And strangely, they accepted lower wages than other factories were offering. When questioned, Crane would smile that famous smile of his and say, "Greater than, my reputation for fairness brings me the best workers from across the region." But one man wasn't convinced. Thomas O'Brien. Thomas O'Brien had been a foreman at the Crane Steelworks for 8 years. A practical Irishman, he had spent most of his life in furnaces and foundries, and he knew steel like a preacher knows his Bible. At first, He accepted the flow of new workers as just another perk of working for the great Bartholomew Crane. But over time, he noticed things that didn't sit right. Unlike other factories, where workers bonded, drank together, and built friendships, Crane's workforce seemed strangely transient. Men appeared, worked for a few weeks or months, and then vanished. At first, O'Brien chalked it up to the grueling nature of steelwork. Maybe the new hires just moved on. But when he kept informal records, a disturbing pattern emerged. It wasn't just unskilled laborers disappearing. Some of his best men, skilled German and Irish immigrants with years of experience, vanished without warning. So did young farm boys from the area, the kind who had taken the job to support wives and children. These weren't drifters. These were men building lives. And then, gone. The strange letters. O'Brien grew uneasy. He tried to track down some of the missing men. But when he visited their boarding houses, their rooms had been cleaned out as if they had never existed. At the train station, clerks had no record of tickets purchased in their names. And then there were the letters. Families of the missing workers began receiving handwritten notes. The letters explained that the men had found better opportunities in other cities and would send for their loved ones soon. The details were so convincing that most families believed them. But O'Brien noticed something strange. The handwriting was different in each letter, yet there were subtle similarities, as though one person was disguising his script. Even worse, the letters contained personal details about the workers' families and dreams, details O'Brien remembered hearing in private conversations. Someone was listening. Someone was taking notes. Watching the wagons. Determined to uncover the truth, O'Brien began his own investigation. He started arriving at the steelworks before dawn and staying late after sunset. That's when he saw it. In the darkest hours of the night, when shifts were changing and the factory should have been quiet, horse-drawn wagons slipped through the rear entrance. The drivers wore heavy coats pulled up to hide their faces, even in mild weather. And their cargo, not crates of ore or steel, but people. Men, women, even children. Their movements were slow and stumbling, as if they were drunk or drugged. Guards led them into a back section of the factory O'Brien had always assumed was just for storage. But once they went inside, they never came out. Instead, new workers appeared in the foundries the next day. Men who looked nothing like the ones brought in on the wagons, but who somehow had the same clothes, the same lunch pails. The pattern repeated night after night. Following the trail. Finally, O'Brien made a decision that would change his life. On a moonless night in November 1890, he followed one of the wagons. He trailed it through the dark countryside for nearly an hour until it turned down a private road leading to Crane Manor. Hidden among oak trees, O'Brien watched as the wagon pulled up to a basement entrance. Torches flickered. Guards unloaded about a dozen people. But this time, they weren't rough laborers. They were well-dressed women, elderly couples, and several children. All appeared unconscious or barely able to walk. They had to be dragged or carried into the mansion. O'Brien's blood ran cold when he recognized one of the women. It was Catherine MacLeod, a young widow who had come to the factory many times asking about her missing husband. Her husband had been a steelworker who vanished 6 months earlier. And now Catherine herself was being pulled into the bowels of Crane Manor. The first crack. For Thomas O'Brien, there was no longer any doubt. The rumors were true. The missing weren't running away. They weren't finding better jobs in other towns. They were being taken. But the question was, taken for what? And why did Bartholomew Crane need such a constant supply of the desperate, the poor, and the forgotten? O'Brien didn't yet have the answers. But his discovery marked the first crack in Crane's empire, a fracture that would only grow as more evidence came to light. Because soon, the word, processed, the single, chilling mark in the ledger, would begin to reveal its meaning. And what it meant, was worse than anyone could have imagined. Right finger if this story has your heart racing, make sure you hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. We love hearing from mystery seekers across America. Part 3 will uncover the terrifying secrets hidden beneath the floors of Crane Manor. Do you want me to make part 3 focus directly on the basement of Crane Manor and O'Brien's discoveries, or build suspense by first showing how society kept celebrating Crane while more disappearances piled up before O'Brien uncovered the true horror? Part 3: The Wives' Secret. Hook. Imagine living in the grandest house in Indiana. Chandeliers sparkle, banquets never end, and the world believes you're part of the luckiest family alive. But late at night, when the music fades and the halls grow silent, you hear whispers through the walls. You hear machines pounding deep in the basement, and sometimes, faint cries for help. What would you do if you discovered that your perfect home was built on a nightmare? By the winter of 1891, Thomas O'Brien was no longer the only one suspicious of Bartholomew Crane. Others had begun to notice the cracks. Sister Margaret O'Connell, who ran a Catholic orphanage on the east side of Fort Wayne, kept her own list of missing people. Families who had written to her asking for help suddenly stopped replying. Men who had left for work at Crane's mills never returned. Even women who had been hired as housekeepers at Crane's estates had vanished without a trace. The nun confronted Crane once. Instead of answers, she received a donation big enough to keep her orphanage running for an entire year, along with a warning smile that told her to drop the matter. And then came the most dangerous observers of all, Crane's wives. Eleanor Hartwell, Crane's first wife, had known him since he was nothing more than a steelworker with dreams bigger than his paycheck. She had been proud to stand beside him as his fortune grew. But as his power spread, she watched her husband collect wives the way other men collected land or railroads. By 1891, the Cranes were spoken of as America's strangest but wealthiest household, a man with many wives and countless children, all living in a palace-like manor on the edge of town. To the world, it seemed like harmony. But Eleanor knew better. She managed the household accounts, and the numbers didn't add up. Week after week, enormous amounts of food were ordered, 3 times more than the family and servants could possibly eat. Medical supplies were purchased in bulk, as though someone were running a private hospital. And then there were payments, large sums sent to people Eleanor had never heard of, for services never explained. When she asked Bartholomew about it, he only smiled and said, "Business, my dear. Just business." But Eleanor could not shake the feeling that there was more. Other wives began to notice things too. Margaret Sullivan, the third wife, confided that her youngest children often woke from nightmares. They spoke of sad people in the walls, and voices under the floor. Victoria Welch, Crane's fifth wife, said her teenage daughter had glimpsed strange faces staring from windows in parts of the manor no one was supposed to live in. The women, once rivals for their husband's attention, began to meet secretly in Eleanor's sitting room. Whispers grew into confessions. Each wife brought a piece of the puzzle, and together the pieces painted a terrifying picture. Strange deliveries arriving at midnight. Servants replaced by new ones who worked only in locked-off sections of the house. An unshakable smell of metal and smoke drifting up from the basement. The Crane wives, trapped inside the gilded cage of their own mansion, realized they were living atop something monstrous. The proof came when Margaret Sullivan discovered a hidden passage. Behind a bookshelf in the library was a narrow staircase, cold and damp, spiraling far below the house. She descended alone one afternoon, her heart pounding with each step. The stair ended at a heavy wooden door secured with 3 iron locks. From behind the door came the sounds of industry, clanging metal, turning wheels, the hiss of steam. But those noises were not the worst. There were voices too. Weak, tired voices. Some spoke in languages Margaret couldn't understand. Others begged for water. And then she heard it. The sob of a child, thin and hopeless. Margaret fled the passage, shaken to her core. When she told the other wives, silence fell over the room. They all understood what it meant. Bartholomew Crane wasn't just building a steel empire. He was building it on the backs of people imprisoned in his own home. They wanted to confront him. They wanted to run, but fear bound them in place. If Crane could make entire families disappear, what might he do to his own wives and children if they disobeyed him? Their dread turned into pure terror when one of their own children vanished. It was December of 1891 when 7-year-old Timothy Crane, Eleanor's youngest, disappeared while playing in the west wing of the manor. Panic tore through the household. Servants searched every corridor, every room, every corner of the massive estate. Hours passed before Timothy was finally found, curled up in his bed, sound asleep. At first, Eleanor wept with relief. But then she noticed the details. Timothy's clean clothes were now stained with dirt and carried the sharp, metallic odor of the forbidden basement halls. His throat was raw, his cough deep, as though he had breathed smoke or chemicals. And when she asked him what had happened, his words froze her blood. "I was with the working people downstairs, Mama," he whispered. "The sad place. The place where nobody can leave. The wives knew the truth then, though none dared speak it aloud. They lived in a mansion that doubled as a prison. Their husband, the man praised as Indiana's greatest benefactor, was hiding something beneath their feet, something built on stolen lives. And if Timothy could be taken and returned, then none of them, not even the children, were safe." Part 3 ends here, but the nightmare was only deepening. For O'Brien, Sister Margaret, and now the wives of Bartholomew Crane, the walls of silence around Fort Wayne were closing in. And soon, they would be forced to choose between survival and exposing the most powerful man in America. Right finger if you want me to continue with part 4, another 1,000 words, new hook, more suspense. I can draft it next. Part 4, The Journal of Shadows. Hook. What would you do if you uncovered the darkest secret in your town, but no one would listen? Imagine holding proof of crimes so terrible they could shake the whole country, yet every door you knock on slams shut. That's exactly what happened in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1892. And the man at the center of it all was Bartholomew Crane. Thomas O'Brien couldn't sleep anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that unconscious woman being carried into the basement of Crane's estate. He heard the faint cries drifting through the night air. He smelled the metallic smoke. The sheriff wouldn't believe him. The newspaper editor had laughed in his face. Even the churches turned their heads. Crane's money reached into every pocket in Fort Wayne. But O'Brien had something no one else did, his journal. By early 1892, O'Brien was spending every night tracking Crane's wagons. He wrote down the times, the routes, the faces of the men who drove them. He noted the way the wagons left full of people and returned empty, or worse, came back with crates that rattled and leaked a sickening red liquid. His journal became his weapon. If no one would believe him, then one day, when the truth came out, his words would speak for themselves. He hid the book beneath a loose floorboard in his boarding house, covering it with an old rug. He knew if Crane's men ever found it, he wouldn't live to see the next sunrise. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret O'Connell continued her own quiet investigation. At night, after putting the orphans to bed, she lit a single candle and compared her list of missing families to O'Brien's notes. Though they never spoke directly, they feared spies were everywhere. Their records told the same story. Entire families lured with promises of work. Children promised schooling and care. Mothers and fathers promised steady wages. All of them swallowed up by Crane's empire, never to be seen again. The nun began to pray more desperately than ever before. She prayed not just for the souls of the missing, but for protection, for strength, for courage. Because she knew the day was coming when silence would no longer be enough. Inside Crane Manor, the wives carried their own secret burden. Eleanor, Margaret, and Victoria continued their quiet meetings, whispering in locked rooms. They had seen too much to ignore it anymore. Eleanor could not forget the cough in her son Timothy's chest. Margaret could not forget the cries behind the locked basement door. Victoria could not forget the pale face of a woman she once glimpsed in a shuttered window, a woman who vanished the moment she turned her head. And all of them lived with the same gnawing fear. If their children could be taken and returned once, what was stopping it from happening again? In the spring of 1892, O'Brien decided to take a greater risk. He mailed copies of several journal pages to newspapers outside Indiana, Chicago, St. Lewis, even as far as New York. He didn't sign his name, but he hoped the evidence would spark curiosity. Weeks passed. No replies came. Then, one morning, O'Brien returned to his room to find the floorboard pried open and the journal gone. He froze in the doorway, heart hammering. The rug was thrown aside, the wood splintered. Someone had searched his hiding place. On the table lay a single calling card. In elegant black ink it read, B. Crane. No threats, no words, just the name. It was enough. O'Brien grabbed what little money he had, stuffed it in his pocket, and fled into the night. He no longer felt safe in Fort Wayne. But Crane's reach was longer than O'Brien imagined. That summer, Sister Margaret noticed two well-dressed men waiting outside the orphanage gates, watching her every move. They never spoke to her, never approached the children, but their presence was constant. Late one night, someone left a box on the orphanage steps. Inside was a stack of coins, enough money to feed the children for months. But lying on top of the coins was a single note, written in Crane's precise handwriting. For the care of the little ones. Do not trouble yourself with matters that do not concern you. Her hands shook as she read it. She understood the message clearly. Keep quiet, or the children would pay the price. The true breaking point came in June 1892. Margaret Sullivan's daughter, 8-year-old Catherine, woke screaming in the middle of the night. When her mother rushed to her bedside, Catherine clung to her with wide, terrified eyes. Mama, she whispered, I saw them again. The sad people, they live under the floors. They asked me to help them. They said they can't breathe. Margaret held her daughter tight, but in her heart she knew Catherine wasn't dreaming. The children of Crane Manor had begun to see and hear what the adults were too afraid to admit. The wives' secret meetings grew more frantic. They whispered about escape, about smuggling the children away. But where could they go? Crane's influence stretched across the state. They were prisoners in their own home, gilded cages and velvet chains binding them tighter than any iron bars. Meanwhile, O'Brien, hiding in Chicago, tried to rally help. He carried copies of his missing journal entries, but editors scoffed at him. You expect us to believe the richest man in Indiana is running a dungeon under his house? Come now, sir, we print news, not ghost stories. Doors slammed. Letters went unanswered. The more he pushed, the more he was treated like a lunatic. But O'Brien refused to give up. He began to write not just notes, but full accounts, every sight, every sound, every missing face he had tracked. He wrote about the wagons, the smoke, the faint screams, the boy Timothy and his terrible words about the sad place where nobody can leave. It was no longer just a journal. It was a book of shadows, a record of horror. And O'Brien swore to himself, even if it killed him, the truth about Bartholomew Crane would not stay buried forever. The year 1892 ended with a heavy silence over Fort Wayne. The townspeople still praised Crane at banquets and church services. His mills still roared, his money still flowed, and his wives still smiled for visitors. But behind that polished mask, terror was spreading. O'Brien was hunted. Sister Margaret was watched. The wives were trapped, and in the locked basements of Crane Manor, the machines kept pounding, the prisoners kept crying, and the shadows grew darker with every passing night. Part 4 ends here, but in Part 5, the horror inside Crane Manor will break into the open, and no amount of money will be able to hide it. Part 5 The Night of the Broken Silence. Hook. What if the truth you've been hiding suddenly broke loose, and the whole city could hear it? In the summer of 1893, the terrible secrets buried inside Bartholomew Crane's empire began to spill into the open. For the first time, the whispers in the shadows turned into screams no one could ignore. The year 1893 should have been Crane's triumph. He had expanded his mills, built new homes, and donated a fortune to Fort Wayne's churches and schools. Newspapers called him the model of American success. Politicians whispered his name as a future governor. But inside Crane Manor, fear was tightening like a noose. The wives no longer met in secret just to whisper, they now met to plan. The strange sounds from beneath the floors had grown louder, harder to ignore. The servants walked around pale and silent, as if afraid of their own voices. And the children were having nightmares every single night. Eleanor Hartwell, Crane's first wife, was no longer willing to look the other way. She had lived with Crane for 15 years. She had seen him transform from a hungry steelworker into the most feared man in Indiana. And now she was beginning to see what price had been paid for that rise. The breaking point came on a stormy night in July. Lightning flashed across the sky, thunder shook the ground, and the children huddled together in the nursery. Eleanor was trying to calm them when she heard it, clearer than ever before. Voices. They weren't echoes or dreams. They were real, rising from the basement like the sound of a church choir in reverse. But these weren't hymns of hope. They were cries of suffering. Help us, please, we can't breathe. And then, for the first time, the pounding of machines stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Moments later, the manor shook with a sound none of the wives could mistake. A scream. High, piercing, human. This was no nightmare. It was real. Margaret Sullivan, the third wife, could not hold her fear any longer. She ran to Eleanor's room, dragging Victoria Welch with her. Together, they listened as the sounds from the basement grew louder. Doors slamming, chains rattling, voices rising in desperation. We must go down there, Margaret whispered, her hands trembling. Eleanor shook her head. No, if he finds us. But before she could finish, another scream tore through the house, this one closer. Too close. It was a child's scream. Down in the West Wing, young Catherine Sullivan, Margaret's daughter, had wandered from her bed, drawn by curiosity and fear. She had always been sensitive to the strange happenings in the manor. That night, she had followed the voices to a half-open door leading to a staircase. The scream had been hers, cut short as the door slammed shut behind her. When the wives reached the West Wing, the door was locked tight. No matter how they pounded or cried out her name, there was no answer. Margaret collapsed in Eleanor's arms, sobbing. The wives knew then that the secret was no longer something they could contain. Their children were in danger. Their very lives were in danger. Meanwhile, Thomas O'Brien was back in Fort Wayne. After months hiding in Chicago, he had returned under a false name, working as a dockhand by day and sneaking around Crane's factories at night. He had learned to move quietly, to listen more than speak. He carried a small pistol now, tucked under his coat, though he doubted it would be much use against Crane's men. On the very night Catherine Sullivan disappeared, O'Brien was watching one of the steelworks from a shadowed alley. Around midnight, a wagon rolled out of the gates. But this time, instead of heading into the countryside, it rumbled toward town. O'Brien followed, heart racing. The wagon stopped at the river, near the old grain docks. The drivers climbed down and began unloading heavy crates. O'Brien crept closer, his boots silent on the wet ground. One of the crates slipped and cracked open. What spilled out was not grain, not tools, not supplies. It was a human arm. O'Brien gagged and pressed himself against the wall. The drivers cursed, shoving the limb back inside and resealing the crate. Then they heaved it onto a waiting barge. The river. Crane was using the river. O'Brien's hand shook as he scribbled notes in his pocketbook. He had proof again. But would anyone listen? Before he could slip away, one of the drivers lifted a lantern and swept it across the docks. The light passed over O'Brien's face. Their eyes met. O'Brien ran. Back at the manor, Eleanor made a decision. She could no longer protect her children by silence. If Crane's empire was built on kidnapping and murder, then silence was no longer safety. It was complicity. The next morning, while Crane was away at the mills, Eleanor gathered the wives in her sitting room. Margaret was pale, nearly hysterical over her missing daughter. Victoria sat stiff and quiet, her hands twisting her handkerchief until it tore. Eleanor laid out a plan. They would write everything down, every sound, every sight, every disappearance. They would create their own record, just like O'Brien's journal. And if they could not find help in Fort Wayne, They would smuggle their stories out of Indiana altogether. Margaret lifted her tear-streaked face. And Catherine, Eleanor took her hand. We will find her. And when we do, we will not stay silent anymore. That very week, the manor erupted with chaos. Servants whispered about locked doors suddenly standing open. Footsteps echoing in empty corridors. A woman's figure seen gliding across the hallways at night, pale as death. The wives began to notice something else too. Crane himself seemed different. He returned home later, his eyes bloodshot, his temper shorter. He spent hours in the basement, emerging with clothes stained and reeking of smoke and chemicals. The mask of the perfect family man was slipping. And soon, it would be ripped away entirely. By the end of 1893, the first cracks had spread beyond the manor. Rumors were reaching the working-class neighborhoods, whispered in taverns and at church steps. Mothers warned their children not to walk near Crane's mills after dark. Hobos riding the rails swore that men went into the steelworks and never came out. The city's silence was starting to falter. And Bartholomew Crane knew it. Part 5 ends here. In Part 6, the horrors of Crane's empire will spill fully into public view, and the city of Fort Wayne will never be the same again. Part 6, the sickness in the air. Hook. Imagine living in a city where the air itself carried secrets, where every gust of smoke from the factory chimneys whispered of something rotten. By the winter of 1894, the truth about Bartholomew Crane was no longer just a whisper in Fort Wayne. It was seeping into the streets, poisoning the city like a disease. Fort Wayne had grown used to the constant smoke of progress. The steelworks never slept, and the sky was always gray with soot. But by early 1894, people began to notice something different in the air. It wasn't just smoke. It was heavier, sharper, almost metallic. Children coughed until their throats bled. Horses collapsed in the streets. Laundry hung outside came back inside streaked with strange yellow stains that no soap could wash away. The doctors called it industrial fever. The poor called it the sickness in the air. But a handful of people knew the truth. This was no ordinary pollution. This was the smell of Crane's empire bleeding into the city. Thomas O'Brien had not given up. Despite being hunted after his discovery at the river docks, he returned night after night, recording what he saw. He counted the wagons, timed the deliveries, traced the crates that vanished downstream. His notebook was filling with names, numbers, and details too precise to ignore. But O'Brien was no longer the only one keeping records. Inside Crane Manor, Eleanor and the wives had begun their own secret journal. Each page was a confession of what they had seen and heard. The screams in the basement, the disappearances, the strange illnesses among their children. Eleanor hid the journal inside the nursery's wall, behind a loose brick, praying that if she were ever silenced, the book would one day speak for her. The breaking point came in February. A snowstorm had blanketed the city, muffling the usual roar of the mills. For once, the night was quiet. That's when people across Fort Wayne heard it, faint but unmistakable. A scream, not one, dozens, rising from the direction of Crane Manor, carried on the wind like the wails of the damned. Neighbors lit lanterns, stumbling into the streets, asking one another if they had heard it too. Some swore it was the sound of a train wreck. Others said it was a fire. But when men rode out to investigate, the manor stood dark and silent, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The next morning, Bartholomew Crane himself appeared in town, smiling and charming as ever. He donated $10,000 to the church, promised jobs for unemployed men, and dismissed the rumors with a laugh. "The storm was playing tricks on your ears," he said. "My family slept soundly." Most of the city wanted to believe him. But doubt had been planted. Inside the manor, the wives were shaken. The screams had been louder than ever before, as if the people below were pushing against the walls themselves. Margaret Sullivan, still grieving the loss of her daughter Catherine, was convinced it was a sign. "They will not stay hidden much longer," she whispered to Eleanor. "Whatever is keeping down there, it wants out." Eleanor felt the same dread. She had begun noticing small cracks in the stone floors, strange vibrations in the walls, as if the very house itself was groaning under the weight of its secret. And then came the fire. It began in the east wing of the manor, late at night, when most of the family was asleep. Servants rushed through the halls, shouting and carrying buckets. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of children crying. The blaze spread quickly, but strangely, it burned not upward toward the roof, but downward, into the floors. The wives huddled together with their children on the lawn, watching the fire chew at the ground as if trying to reach something buried beneath. And then, through the smoke, Eleanor saw it. A section of the basement wall had collapsed, and behind it, for just a moment, she glimpsed movement. Dozens of pale faces, thin arms reaching, eyes hollow with hunger and despair. Prisoners. Before she could cry out, Crane himself appeared, his silver hair glowing in the firelight. He barked orders to his men, who rushed not to save the burning wing, but to seal off the basement with new timbers and iron. The fire was contained, the wall rebuilt, and by dawn, the east wing stood in ruins while the rest of the manor loomed untouched. To the neighbors who came to help, Crane explained it away. A faulty furnace, he said, smiling through the smoke. Nothing more. But Eleanor knew what she had seen. And so did her children, who whispered about the sad people in the walls, for weeks afterward. Meanwhile, sickness was spreading in the city. Men who worked in Crane's mills began collapsing at their furnaces, coughing up blackened blood. Women who had taken domestic jobs at the Crane estates disappeared without farewell. Whole families vanished from boarding houses overnight, their trunks left behind as if they had been snatched away in their sleep. And still, no one dared speak publicly. But O'Brien was ready. He had gathered enough proof, pages of notes, sketches of wagons, even scraps of stained clothing he had pulled from the river. He knew he couldn't go to the sheriff or the newspapers in Fort Wayne. They were bought and paid for. Instead, he made plans to travel to Indianapolis, to present his findings directly to the governor's office. What O'Brien didn't know was that Crane already suspected him. Back at the manor, the wives made a choice. If Eleanor's hidden journal was ever found, it could save their children. But if they were discovered writing it, it could doom them all. Still, they wrote, each entry darker than the last. Each page a testimony of horror. Margaret Sullivan's final entry that winter was only one sentence long. I hear Catherine's voice at night. She is crying beneath my feet. By the spring of 1894, the sickness in the air could no longer be ignored. Children were dying. Workers were vanishing. Families whispered of ghosts along the riverbanks. Fort Wayne was beginning to wake up. But waking up would mean facing the nightmare directly, and the nightmare's name was Bartholomew Crane. Right finger end of part 6. In part 7, O'Brien will finally try to break the story wide open, but Crane's grip on Indiana is stronger than anyone imagines. Part 7, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Hook. What would you do if you uncovered a secret so dark, so dangerous, that speaking it aloud could cost your life? In the spring of 1894, journalist Thomas O'Brien carried such a secret in his coat pocket, and every shadow in Fort Wayne seemed to follow him. O'Brien had seen enough to damn Bartholomew Crane forever. He had followed the wagons, traced the river routes, and even glimpsed the faces behind the manor walls. His notebook bulged with names and numbers, evidence that could shatter the Crane dynasty. But he knew Fort Wayne was not safe. The sheriff was a drinking companion of Crane's. The newspapers received donations every month. Even the local priest had grown fat from Crane's charity. If O'Brien spoke in town, he would not live to see the sunrise. So he planned an escape. Indianapolis, the governor, maybe even Chicago, where reporters loved nothing more than bringing down a corrupt empire. But first, he had to get out alive. The night before his journey, O'Brien stopped at a tavern by the rail yard. He sat in the corner, notebook hidden beneath his coat, nursing a glass of whiskey. Around him, the air buzzed with talk of sickness and fear. 3 more children dead on Hannah Street. My husband never came back from the mill. Did you hear the screaming last month? The city was cracking, like ice breaking on a thawing river. People wanted to talk, but no one dared to say the Crane name out loud. As O'Brien listened, a man slid onto the bench across from him. Broad shoulders, thick hands, the smell of coal smoke. He didn't order a drink. He just stared. "You're the one asking questions," the man said flatly. O'Brien's hand tightened on his glass. "Depends who's asking." The man leaned closer. His voice was low, but urgent. "My brother works at the East Mill. He saw what Crane does with the bodies. He hasn't slept in weeks. If you're leaving town, you need to take him with you. Please." O'Brien's heart quickened. Finally, an ally. Someone else who knew. But before he could answer, the tavern door creaked open. 2 men in long coats entered, scanning the room. O'Brien recognized them immediately, Crane's watchmen. The stranger's face drained of color. "Too late," he whispered. He stood quickly, disappearing into the smoke-filled crowd. O'Brien was left alone, the watchman's eyes closing in on him like wolves on a stag. That night, O'Brien didn't go home. He slipped through alleys, dodging lamplight, moving like a ghost through his own city. Twice, he thought he heard footsteps behind him. Once, he was sure he saw Crane himself, tall and silver-haired, watching from a passing carriage. By dawn, O'Brien was at the station, his ticket to Indianapolis clutched in his sweating hand. The train screeched into the platform, steam hissing like the breath of some great beast. He climbed aboard, found a seat, and pressed his notebook to his chest. At last, he thought. Safety. But the train never made it to Indianapolis. 2 hours south of Fort Wayne, just past a lonely stretch of forest, the train lurched violently. Passengers screamed as sparks flew from the engine. The cars screeched to a halt, metal groaning like an animal in pain. O'Brien stumbled from his seat, clutching his notebook. He peered through the window. Ahead, the tracks were blocked, deliberately, by a fallen tree. Outside, men in long coats approached, their boots crunching in the gravel. Not bandits. Not thieves. Watchmen. Crane's men. The conductor shouted, waving his arms. The men shot him where he stood. Chaos erupted in the cars. Families shrieked, children cried, passengers ducked for cover. O'Brien forced his way to the back, searching for escape. But the men were boarding, one by one, dragging out passengers, checking faces. And then O'Brien heard it, his own name. Thomas O'Brien. Step forward. He didn't. He ran. Out the back of the train, into the woods, crashing through brambles with the notebook pressed to his chest. Behind him, voices roared. Gunshots cracked. Bullets ripped through the trees. O'Brien ran until his lungs burned, until the world spun around him. Finally, he tumbled down a slope, splashing into a shallow creek. He lay there, gasping, the cold water numbing his limbs. When he dared to look up, the woods were silent. The watchmen were gone, but so was his notebook. Somewhere in the scramble, it had been torn from his grasp. For days, O'Brien hid. He moved from barn to barn, begging food from farmers, sleeping in haylofts. He had nothing left, no money, no papers, no proof. Only his memory, but memory alone would not bring down Crane. One night, as he shivered in an abandoned shack, O'Brien made a vow. If he could not expose Crane with words, he would expose him with his life. He would break into Crane Manor itself. Back in Fort Wayne, Eleanor Crane felt a similar desperation. The fire in the East Wing had scarred her children, and Margaret Sullivan's grief had turned into madness. She spoke openly of Catherine's ghost, of the cries in the walls, of the basement that breathed at night. The servants began to quit, one by one. Neighbors whispered of curses. Even the wives, once bound by fear, began to plot. Eleanor's hidden journal grew thicker. Each page was soaked in terror. But she knew words alone were not enough. Someone had to act. And when she learned that Thomas O'Brien was still alive, hiding in the city, she knew he might be the only man reckless enough to try. The sickness in the air worsened. More children dead. Entire families missing. Fort Wayne was sliding into hysteria. But Crane smiled through it all. He held banquets, funded parades, donated to orphanages. He was the city's shining benefactor, its silver-haired savior. And yet, in the shadows, the walls of his empire were beginning to crack. Because O'Brien was coming back. And this time, he wasn't just carrying a notebook. He was carrying a death wish. Right finger end of part 7. In part 8, O'Brien will return to Fort Wayne to strike directly at Crane Manor. But inside those walls, he will find more than just secrets, he will find the nightmare waiting for him. Part 8 Into the House of Shadows. Hook. What would you do if the only way to stop a monster was to walk straight into his lair? In the winter of 1894, Thomas O'Brien made the most dangerous decision of his life. He was going back into Crane Manor. O'Brien had nothing left to lose. His notes were gone, stolen by Crane's men. His reputation was ruined, dismissed as a drunk and a liar. The law, the church, and the newspapers had all turned their backs. But he still had his memory. He still had his eyes. And now, with Eleanor Crane secretly reaching out to him through coded letters delivered by a trusted servant, he had something else, an ally inside the House of Horrors. The wives were ready to act. They had seen too much. They had heard too much. And now, with their children falling sick from strange fumes and strange foods, they were desperate. Eleanor promised O'Brien a way in, but warned that he might never come out. It was midnight when O'Brien approached the manor again. A bitter wind cut across the frozen fields. The windows of the mansion glowed faintly, but most of the house lay in shadow. A lantern flickered twice from the east wing, that was the signal. Eleanor had left a door unlatched. O'Brien pressed forward, heart hammering, revolver hidden in his coat. He wasn't a hero, not really. He was a man terrified of dying. But he was more terrified of letting Crane's crimes continue. Inside, the manor smelled of polish and perfume, but underneath lingered another odor. Metallic, acrid, like burning iron. He crept through dark corridors, passing portraits of Crane's stern ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, judging, warning. And then he heard it. The sound Eleanor had described. A steady, mechanical rhythm, like iron striking iron, faint but unmistakable. It came from deep within the house, below. The basement. Eleanor was waiting in her sitting room, pale and trembling. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You asked me to," O'Brien answered. Her hands shook as she handed him a folded paper. A map, drawn in secret, marking hidden staircases and locked doors. "The children speak of voices," she said. "Of crying under the floors. I hear it too. I fear what you'll find, Mr. O'Brien. But you must see it. You must, so the world will know." Before he could reply, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Eleanor shoved him toward the bookshelf. "Go, now." The shelf swung open on silent hinges, revealing the narrow stair Margaret Sullivan had once discovered. O'Brien descended, the door closing softly behind him. The staircase spiraled downward, stone walls slick with damp. The air grew colder, thicker. Each step seemed to pull him deeper into another world, a place where sunlight had never existed. At the bottom, he reached a heavy wooden door. He pressed his ear against it. Voices. Dozens of them. Some crying, some whispering prayers, some coughing so violently it echoed like thunder. And beneath it all, the steady groan of machinery. He forced the door open. And froze. The basement was vast, far larger than the manor above. A hidden complex, stretched into the earth, lit by rows of smoking lamps. Iron cages lined the walls. Inside them, men, women, even children huddled together, thin as skeletons, their eyes wide with terror. Some reached out through the bars as O'Brien entered, begging in broken voices. Beyond the cages, furnaces blazed. Strange machines clattered and roared, powered by gears and belts. Prisoners worked the machines under the watch of guards, their bodies weak, their movements slow. The air was suffocating, choked with smoke, coal dust, and something else. Something chemical. It burned O'Brien's throat, made his eyes water. This wasn't just a prison. It was a factory of the damned. O'Brien staggered forward, unable to believe his eyes. He scribbled furiously in a new notebook he had smuggled in his coat, recording everything: the cages, the furnaces, the guards, the suffering. A hand grabbed his sleeve. He turned to see a gaunt woman, her hair matted, her eyes fever bright. "Please," she whispered, "take my boy. He's sick. He won't last another night." She tried to push a limp child into O'Brien's arms. O'Brien froze, heartbreaking, knowing he couldn't carry anyone out. Not yet. Not until the world knew. But the decision was torn from him when a shout rang out. "Intruder! Dash dash dash!" The guards charged, boots pounding. O'Brien fled, notebook clutched tight. He ducked between machines, dodging chains, stumbling through smoke. Prisoners cried out as the chaos spread. He found another staircase, bolted up it 2 steps at a time, lungs burning. Behind him, gunshots echoed, sparks flying from the stone. At the top, he crashed into a corridor of the manor. The opulence of Crane's world looked obscene now, draped in velvet and gold, while just below lay misery and death. He had to escape. He had to live long enough to tell. But as he reached the end of the hall, a tall figure stepped into his path. Bartholomew Crane. Dash dash dash. The steel magnate looked almost serene. His silver hair glowed in the lamplight, his tailored suit spotless, his eyes cold as ice. "You've seen too much, Mr. O'Brien," he said calmly. His voice carried the weight of power, the tone of a man who owned the law, the press, and the church. "Do you have any idea how long I've built this? How many depend on me? Do you think you can destroy it with a notebook?" O'Brien raised his revolver, his hand shaking. "The world will know," he hissed. Crane smiled. A thin, knowing smile. "Then you will never leave this house alive." Dash dash dash. The chase began. O'Brien fled through the corridors as Crane's guards closed in. The manor echoed with chaos, shouts, doors slamming, the distant wails of prisoners below. Somewhere, Eleanor screamed. Somewhere else, a child began to cough, a cough that spread into the night like an omen. O'Brien burst through a side door and into the freezing air. He didn't stop running. Not when the dogs barked. Not when the shots rang out behind him. Not even when his lungs felt like they would tear apart. He vanished into the Indiana night. Alive, barely, but he had seen the truth. And once a man sees hell, he can never close his eyes again. Dash dash dash. Right finger end of part 8. In part 9, O'Brien will try to spread what he saw, but Crane's reach stretches farther than he imagined. The city itself may turn against him. Part 9, the city turns against him. Hook. What happens when the truth is too terrible for people to believe? In the spring of 1895, Thomas O'Brien tried to warn the world about Bartholomew Crane. Instead of becoming a hero, he became a hunted man. Dash dash dash. Thomas O'Brien staggered back into Fort Wayne, half dead from his escape from Crane Manor. His coat was torn, his revolver lost, and his lungs burned with every breath. But he had the most important thing of all, his notebook. Inside were pages of frantic notes, descriptions of the cages, the furnaces, the prisoners, the hidden passageways, even the very words Bartholomew Crane had spoken to him. It was proof. It had to be. Dash dash dash. O'Brien first went to Sister Margaret O'Connell at the orphanage. She was one of the few people who had ever taken his warnings seriously. When she saw the state he was in, she nearly fainted. "My God, Thomas," she whispered, dabbing his bloodied forehead. "What have you done?" "I've seen it," he rasped. "It's worse than we imagined. The cages. The machines. Whole families down there. You were right, sister. He's not just stealing workers. He's keeping them." Sister Margaret read his notes, her hands trembling. She crossed herself, whispering a prayer. Then she looked him in the eye. "You must take this to the governor. To the State House. If Fort Wayne won't listen, Indianapolis must." O'Brien nodded. For the first time in years, he felt the spark of hope. Dash dash dash. But hope is fragile. 2 days later, O'Brien arranged a meeting with a journalist from Chicago, a man he trusted to print the story even if it cost him his career. They agreed to meet at a tavern near the railroad station. The journalist never arrived. Instead, 2 uniformed deputies entered the tavern and arrested O'Brien for inciting public disorder. His notebook was confiscated. His protests meant nothing. At the county jail, he was thrown into a dark cell. The sheriff himself appeared, a smirk on his face. "You just don't learn, do you, Tom?" Sheriff Hendricks said. "I warned you. Keep running your mouth about Crane, and you'll end up in here. Or worse." O'Brien lunged at the bars. "He's killing people, damn it. Families, children." Hendricks only laughed. "Bartholomew Crane feeds this town. He clothes it. He pays my salary, your salary, everyone's. You think people will believe your drunken scribbles over the word of Indiana's greatest benefactor?" He walked away, leaving O'Brien screaming in the dark. 3 nights later, O'Brien was released without explanation. His notebook was gone. His reputation was in ruins. On the streets, people whispered as he passed. Some crossed themselves. Others spat in the dirt. He overheard the talk in saloons and barbershops. "O'Brien's gone mad. Drank himself blind, that one. Poor fool thinks Crane's the devil." It was worse than disbelief. The city had turned against him. Meanwhile, Bartholomew Crane grew only more powerful. His businesses expanded across the Midwest. New factories rose in Ohio and Michigan, all somehow fully staffed while competitors still struggled to find workers. Newspapers printed glowing editorials about his visionary management. Churches praised his endless donations. Politicians begged for his endorsements. But in the quiet corners of Fort Wayne, whispers persisted. A widow swore her son had vanished after applying for a job at the steelworks. A farmer claimed he'd seen wagons moving toward Crane Manor in the dead of night. A servant, dismissed suddenly from the estate, told stories of locked doors and cries in the dark. The whispers spread, but never loudly enough. Fear and dependence on Crane's money kept them muted. Eleanor Crane, however, refused to stay silent. From within the manor, she continued to meet secretly with the other wives. They pieced together small fragments of truth, unexplained deliveries, strange visitors, hidden passages. Eleanor smuggled tiny scraps of information to O'Brien whenever she could, written in coded notes hidden inside books or clothing. But O'Brien was watched. Everywhere he went, Crane's men followed. His boarding house room was searched. Strangers shadowed him at night. Once, he woke to find a dead crow nailed to his door, a warning. Still, he refused to give up. In late summer, O'Brien tried again. He traveled to Indianapolis to plead directly with state officials. Exhausted but determined, he requested an audience with Governor Isaac P. Gray. At first, the governor seemed sympathetic. He listened carefully, nodding as O'Brien described the horrors beneath Crane Manor. He even examined the new notes O'Brien had begun to gather again. But when the meeting ended, Gray sighed heavily. "You must understand, Mr. O'Brien, Indiana is thriving. Our factories are booming, our people employed. And much of that prosperity is thanks to Mr. Crane. If I were to act on your claims, unproven as they are, I would be risking the livelihood of thousands. Do you see my position?" O'Brien slammed his fist on the governor's desk. "And what of the people who vanish? What of the children locked in cages?" The governor's face hardened. "Without hard proof, there is nothing I can do. My advice, sir, is that you forget this madness. For your own sake. On the long train ride back to Fort Wayne, O'Brien sat in silence, staring out the window at the rolling fields. The sun was setting, casting the land in red. He thought of the people underground, who would never see a sunset again. That night, when he stepped off the train, 2 men were waiting. They followed him into the shadows, their footsteps silent, their faces hidden. He turned a corner, then a hand clamped over his mouth. He struggled, but they were too strong. The last thing he remembered was the reek of chloroform. When O'Brien awoke, he was no longer in Fort Wayne. He was in a dark stone room, lit by a single lamp. His wrists were bound, his throat raw. And when his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized where he was. The basement. He had been dragged into the very place he had risked everything to expose. From the shadows, a voice spoke. Calm, cold, familiar. "Welcome back, Mr. O'Brien," said Bartholomew Crane. You should have stayed away. Dash dash dash. Right finger end of part 9. In part 10 final, O'Brien's fate will be revealed, and so will the horrifying legacy of Bartholomew Crane. Dash dash dash. Do you want part 10 to end in total tragedy, Crane's crimes buried forever, or in a dark revelation where at least some of the truth escapes into the world? Part 10 The Final Descent. Hook. Imagine being trapped in the very place you've spent years warning the world about. That's what happened to Thomas O'Brien in 1895, when he awoke in the bowels of Crane Manor. This is the final chapter of Bartholomew Crane's empire of horror. Dash dash dash. When Thomas O'Brien opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Metallic, acrid, the same odor he had smelled on the clothes of Crane's servants, the same one Timothy Crane had described after his strange disappearance. He was chained to a chair, wrists bound with heavy iron cuffs. The room around him was dim, lit by a single gas lamp. The walls were stone, damp and sweating. And from somewhere deeper in the basement came the sound of machinery grinding, striking in steady rhythm. The footsteps came before the voice. Calm, deliberate, echoing in the chamber. Mr. O'Brien, Bartholomew Crane said, stepping into the light. His silver hair gleamed like a crown, his blue eyes sharp as glass. You've caused me more trouble than any man alive. You should have left well enough alone. O'Brien spat blood onto the floor. You're a monster, Crane. Everyone will know the truth. Sooner or later, someone will stop you. Crane smiled, not cruelly, not angrily, but almost with pity. My dear Thomas, I am the truth. I am progress. Without me, Fort Wayne starves. Without me, thousands lose their homes, their jobs, their futures. You think people want to hear about cages and disappearances? They want bread. They want wages. And I give it to them. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Their silence is my protection. Their prosperity is my armor. You could scream from the rooftops, and they would still choose me over you. Dash dash dash. For hours, O'Brien was dragged through the underground complex of Crane Manor. What he saw confirmed every nightmare he had ever imagined. Cages filled with hollow-eyed prisoners. Families huddled together in filth and darkness. Rows of children coughing, their faces pale from lack of sunlight. Furnaces roared in hidden chambers, tended not by willing workers but by captives forced into endless labor. Strange machinery clanged and hissed, machinery that seemed to transform human suffering into industrial profit. And everywhere, the smell. That metallic stench of blood and smoke that clung to the air like a curse. Some prisoners reached out as O'Brien passed, their fingers clawing through the bars. Help us, they whispered. Please. But he could do nothing. His chains were tight, his guards unyielding. Dash dash dash. At last, Crane stopped before a heavy iron door. Behind it came the sound of sobbing. He gestured for the guards to open it. Inside was a small cell. On the floor sat Catherine MacLeod, the widow O'Brien had once tried to help, now gaunt and broken, her eyes wide with terror. She barely recognized him. Thomas. She croaked. They said you were dead. O'Brien fell to his knees beside her. Not yet, he whispered. But maybe soon. Crane watched them coldly. You see, Mr. O'Brien, this is what happens when people pry where they don't belong. Mrs. MacLeod insisted on finding her husband. Now she serves a different purpose. O'Brien glared up at him. You can't keep this hidden forever. Crane's smile returned. Forever. No. But long enough to finish my work. Dash dash dash. That night, O'Brien was returned to his cell. He scratched words into the wall with a loose stone, his final testimony. Names, dates, places, a desperate record in case anyone ever found the chamber. Days passed, or weeks, time lost meaning in the dark. He was fed just enough to keep him alive, his strength ebbing with every hour. And then, one night, chaos erupted. Dash dash dash. It began with fire. Flames spread through the eastern wing of Crane Manor, the same fire that would later reveal the ledger hidden behind the bookshelf. Servants ran screaming. Guards abandoned their posts. The prisoners, sensing freedom, began to riot. O'Brien seized the chance. With the help of Catherine MacLeod, who had stolen a key from a distracted guard, he broke free of his chains. Together, they stumbled through the smoke-filled corridors of the basement. They passed cells where prisoners were clawing at the bars, begging to be released. O'Brien fumbled with keys, unlocking as many as he could before the heat drove him onward. Screams and crashes echoed everywhere. At last, he found a stairwell leading up. He and Catherine staggered into the night, coughing, half blinded by smoke. Behind them, the manor burned like a cathedral in hell. By dawn, the fire was under control. Crane Manor was blackened but still standing. Dozens of bodies were recovered from the ruins, servants, guards, even some of the prisoners who had been unable to escape. But Bartholomew Crane himself was nowhere to be found. Some claimed he had perished in the flames. Others whispered that he had fled into the night, using hidden tunnels that led away from the estate. Thomas O'Brien survived. So did Catherine MacLeod. Together, they tried once more to bring their testimony to the public. They told everything. The cages, the furnaces, the ledger, the hidden passages. But once again, the city turned against them. Officials dismissed their story as hysteria caused by smoke inhalation. Newspapers mocked them as attention seekers. And the ledger, when finally discovered by servants after the fire, was quietly seized by authorities and never seen again. O'Brien lived the rest of his days as a broken man, muttering about the horrors beneath Crane Manor. Catherine vanished a few years later, some say returning to Scotland, others whisper she was taken once more. As for Bartholomew Crane, his empire slowly dissolved after the fire, but his legend lived on. In Fort Wayne, some still call him a visionary. Others call him the devil in human form. And in the ruins of the old manor, on nights when the wind is just right, locals swear you can still hear the sound of machinery beneath the ground, and the faint cries of those who never escaped. Coffin that concludes the dark saga of Bartholomew Crane, America's forgotten industrial horror. Right finger if you've followed this story all the way to the end, we want to hear from you. Do you believe the truth was buried forever, or do you think some pieces of Crane's crimes still linger, waiting to be uncovered? Pushpin, don't forget to subscribe for more historic horror, share this story with fellow mystery seekers, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Because history isn't always just about kings and battles, sometimes, it's about the monsters who built empires in the shadows.